Joining us here in Washington, retired four-star General Jack Keane, chairman of the Institute for the Study of War and Fox News senior strategic analyst. General, we are always grateful for your insights.
Yeah, wonderful to be here. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. So let's start where Trey touched on these referenda that are being held in Ukraine. The New York Times reports it this way. It says Ukrainians were forced to vote while Russian officials or their proxies stood guard. The aim of the hastily called referendum, supported by pro-Russian residents and their proxies, was apparent: to give President Putin of Russia a legally bogus pretext to gobble up their country. What are we to make of these votes?
Yeah, he's just had a military defeat, which is quite sizable, where he's got to conclude that, at least right now, he's losing this war. And this is an attempt to obtain a political victory, largely for his own domestic audience, that they have gobbled up this increased terrain in 4 different regions in Ukraine. I mean, anybody looking at this knows it's a sham, as Trey pointed out and other commentators have. I mean, this is a vote at gunpoint, and it's not going to mean anything. And it certainly is not going to stop the Ukrainians from continuing their military operations inside these territories. After all, they have conducted some significant attacks inside of Crimea, espionage attacks and also missile attacks, which have been annexed by Russia since 2014. So the Ukrainian operations will continue. The political sham, I think, is what it is, and the whole international community sees it as such.
And it seems like these referendums will also tie into some saber-rattling over nuclear use by Putin. The Washington Post talks about this speech he had on Wednesday. They say he made 2 references or 2 threats. He reminded NATO that Russia possesses more modern weapons than the weapons NATO countries have. And Putin pledged that Russia would use all weapons systems available to protect its territorial integrity, Russia's people, as well as Russia's independence and freedom. How do you take those nuclear threats?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think the probability of it is pretty low, but you have to take it seriously because of what these weapons obviously are, the horrific application of what it would mean to Ukraine and to the world writ large. But what's his motivation here? And I think he's brandished these weapons before, or at least he's had his surrogates do it. And I think he's had some success with it because it delayed the distribution of advanced weapons that Zelensky was begging for weeks and weeks and weeks, and it finally took months before we got those systems to him. He likely knows that on the table, the United States is considering sending to Ukraine advanced fighters like F-16s after training the Ukrainians, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and other equipment that will help the Ukrainians with a spring counteroffensive, which would be conventional combined arms to drive them out of the Donbass region. So he likely would like to curb that. Now, let's assume he's serious, and the use of a nuclear weapon is actually on the table, which I think is probably very low. But if you consider that, here's the factors he's got to consider. He would use the nuclear weapon to want to end the war, and that's not going to happen. The Ukrainians, the people, as well as their military, are steadfast. They openly talk about the possibility of a nuclear weapon being targeted against them, and they are going to fight and continue to fight. The second thing is his army on the battlefield. They're not trained to deal with a radioactive nuclear battlefield. The Soviet Union was. They were equipped and properly trained. These guys aren't trained to fight a conventional fight, much less deal with an environment like that. And then the third thing is, this is about taking it serious. I believe the Biden administration has reported that they're talking to Putin and his surrogates about the consequences here, and I hope we're very direct with him about what those consequences would mean. And I think that's likely an expansion of the war. It brings the United States and NATO into it. Not to use nuclear weapons, we wouldn't do that. I don't even think we would put significant amount of ground troops, but we would conduct devastating air and missile attack, largely to destroy his military inside of Ukraine. And he knows that, and so does his military people know that. He wants to win the war. If he uses a nuclear weapon, it guarantees that he loses.
Okay, so let's turn to another region of the world, also filled with tension at this moment. 60 Minutes, the president said last week that we would come, U.S., to Taiwan's defense if China launched an unprovoked attack. And then there was walking back some of that, clarification of that. The Council on Foreign Relations said, while pledging to defend Taiwan from China, Biden shifted on Taiwan independence, and it matters because it says the White House has clarified, or they tried to, that U.S. policy hasn't changed, but officials in Beijing will see this as further evidence that the U.S. is walking away from a one-China policy.
Well, I think the American people must scratch their head here and say, what is going on? In 1979, there was a Taiwan Relations Act that China and the United States agreed to. And the essential ingredient in it, that it would govern China's and the United States behavior as it pertained to the Taiwan Straits. The central theme was peace and stability along those straits. And we said that we would help Taiwan defend itself, made no statement about whether we would physically help them to defend themselves in terms of our own troops. That is called the strategic ambiguity. But in the last 10 years, look what has happened. President Xi has accelerated the military intimidation and coercion of Taiwan. Not only that, on repeated occasions, he has said, if Taiwan does not capitulate and become a part of mainland China, then he will use military force to take control. Now, all of this activity that he's done in 10 years, to include threatening military force, I would suggest he has violated the 1979 Taiwan Agreement to maintain peace and stability. And I think it's quite appropriate, and even more than that, essential, that President Biden make a public declaration. He said it 4 times already in response to a question, but make it a public declaration that, Mr. Xi, if you're going to attack Taiwan, you're forcing me to have to respond militarily to defend it, and I would encourage my allies to do the same. I think that's where we are anyway. Certainly that is where the President of the United States is, and he is the decision maker.
We're just about out of time, so I quickly want to ask you to comment on Israel. Their prime minister making comments at the UN this week. He says we'll do whatever it takes. Iran will not get a nuclear weapon. Yeah,
what we have to understand here, you can have an academic discussion about whether nuclear weapons would be used in the Middle East by Iran. That's not relevant. The only thing that's relevant here is Israel is convinced that if Iran has a nuclear weapon, it's an existential threat because they have repeatedly said for 40 years they intend to destroy the state of Israel. And I believe they've had intelligence for a number of years that indicates that Iran would do just that. And the fact that they have 9 million people densely located in a small country, and Iran has 86 million people in a mountainous large country, that Iran has seriously considered destroying the state of Israel and absorbing a nuclear attack themselves and believing that they could survive it. Now, does that make any sense to anybody? No, but that's not important. The fact is the Israelis believe it, and they believe that Iran clearly has this intent to destroy the state of Israel. So this is a dangerous point we're at. It can lead to conflict, whether there is or not a nuclear deal, because Iran is in pursuit of a nuclear weapon.
General, thank you. Sobering analysis, but very insightful. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Good talking to you.
You too.
I'm Steve Doocy.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.